Hi, and welcome to Redefining Disability, Lecture 1. My name is Gofran Alias, and I will be your instructor for this course. First, we will go through the lecture agenda. So, in this lecture, we will go through lecture objectives, the definition of disability through the medical model, the harms of the medicalized definition of disability, unpacking the medical model definition of disability through some questions, the myth of the medical model, and then we will then redefine disability and then go through resources that I have used to develop this lecture. Lecture objectives. We will begin to define disability. We will begin to think through the different ways that the medical model of disability can negatively impact us and impact our surroundings, the world we live in, and the ways we do things. And then we are going to think through the medical model of disability and rethink the medicalized definition of disability and question, is it indeed the way we're supposed to define disability, or should we think through it in other ways? What is disability? And then from then, we're going to shift away from the medical model and redefine it, and think through what definition we want to hold on to in this course. The medical model definition of disability, and this is a definition that I've pulled up from the Policy on Accessible Education for Students with Disabilities, which defines disability as any degree of physical disability, infirmity, malformation. So when disability is defined as malformation, what is it telling us? How are people with disabilities, disabled people treated? Let's hold on to that question. Disability is defined as a disfigurement that is caused by bodily injury, birth defect, or illness, and without limiting the generality of the foregoing includes diabetes, meltosis, epilepsy, brain injury, any degree of paralysis, amputation, lack of physical coordination, blindness or visual impairment, deafness or hearing impairment, muteness or speech impediment, or physical reliance on a guide dog or any other animal, or on a wheelchair or other remedial appliances or device. So let's keep in mind that in this definition, in this first part of the definition, disability is not only defined using medical terms, using medicalized terms, which defines it as an illness, as a problem, as a deficit, as a defect, and so on, but we also see derogatory terms here that include malformation, disfigurement, and then we begin to see medical conditions such as diabetes being defined as or categorized as a disability. And another thing to keep in mind here as well is that disability is only being defined as a medical problem and through the medical model, and that is all we should think of, and there's no other way of defining it. But in this course, let's be critical of that. A condition or a mental impairment or a developmental disability, so mental impairment, it is something that makes the individual lacking. We often hear expressions like those with disabilities are less than the average human. It takes away from our humanness. Moving on, disability is a learning disability or a dysfunction. So those with disabilities are dysfunctional beings. They have a flaw. There's something quote unquote wrong with them. In one or more processes involved in understanding or using symbols or spoken language. This is where we see that to have language means to speak or nothing. So I'm speaking to you, therefore I am able, and therefore I am considered a typical being, but those who communicate in non-typical ways, such as ASL, through written form or through body language, that's not considered language in this case. But again, we need to be critical. It is a mental disorder, so something that is quote unquote wrong with our mental health or with our brain. And then finally, an injury or disability to which benefits were claimed or received under the insurance plan established under the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act of 1997. So something that qualified a person to receive compensation because they're injured in one way or another. So we saw how disability is being defined. We looked at the medical terms that are being used. We looked at the derogatory terms that are being used that unfortunately we see ourselves using every day, but not really making meaning out of them and what they actually mean. So what are the harms of defining disability in the way we currently do? Disability is thought of as a thing to be avoided. I don't want anything to do with it. Disability will not impact me. It's something I do not want to be touched by. And this is me talking about what other people think. Disability is defined using derogatory terms: malformation, disfigurement, etc. And if you do further research or look into the resources that I will provide in the end slide, such as the policy on accessible education for students with disabilities, you will see that there are the terms that have been used to describe disability in the past are extremely derogatory. extremely derogatory, and it should not be that way. It causes the individual to blame themselves for the problems they experience. So disability is an individual problem in need of a solution, and that solution is to be found by the individual. They need to go and seek help to eradicate, sadly, that disability from their body or mind. Disability is now being defined as lack of ability. Lack of ability becomes lack of humanness, because to be human is to be fully able and to be fully independent and not have to depend on other people. But it is thought that disabled people are dependent and reliant on other individuals around them in order to function. Therefore, they are not fully human or human at all. It pathologizes the person as a whole. So disability becomes this negative thing that is part of the entire person and the only defining factor in which we see them through. It frames disability as something that needs to be cured for the individual to be fully functioning. So, in order for them not to be defined with malformation or as disfigured beings. People with disabilities are often framed as a problem to society. So again, let's go back to thinking of the ways in which disability is defined and ask ourselves, how is a problem being defined? And is it indeed disability that's the problem to society, or is it society that is the problem to those with a difference? So, taking a closer look at the definition, when disability is defined as a malformation, how does it imply that institutions are being inclusive? So, this is a definition that came from the Policy on Accessible Education for Students with Disabilities. But then we see disability being defined as a malformation. Those with disabilities are disfigured, and so on. But then this policy is saying that this policy is in place to ensure that academic institutions provide inclusive and meaningful access to education for those with disabilities. The Policy on Accessible Education for Students with Disabilities 2018 labels disability as a dysfunction, and therefore we must be critical of the claims the policy makes to have positive intentions in serving disabled people. According to the definition, a disability is a learning disability or a dysfunction in one or more of the processes involved in understanding or using symbols or spoken language. So, what does that tell us about the ways in which the perfect human is defined? And what more signs do we need than this to tell us that our society still today, from when this definition was developed, which was in 1997, still today, language or disability, pardon me, is being defined that way, and that our society is built on a one-size-fits-all. It is standard, and if you do not fit the mold, then you're inferior. You're not the person this society has in mind. And then finally, the final 2 points are, in this definition, if an individual does not conform to societal norms when it comes to the way they learn or speak, they are labeled as dysfunctional. So if you can't learn, if you can't do things based on the agenda that society has, then there's something wrong with you. What does this tell us about the way society thinks of a problem? Again, and is it the individual that is the problem, or is it society? Let's think very carefully about this question as we look through the rest of this lecture, but also more specifically, the definition of disability, which is extremely deep. The myth of the medical model, and it's in the title, the biggest myth. When disability is cured, the person won't experience problems. Struggles are all gone. If we operate on the individual to fix the disability, they will live normal lives. So we need to eradicate the disability from their, or take disability away and let it be eradicated from their bodies. Disability is an individual problem, again, in need of a solution. And that individual with the problem usually needs to go out and find that solution and go get help, because otherwise their lives are not worth living. If the person is non-disabled, they will not have to rely on others for help. I've included a resource at the end of this lecture, a blog post / article by Mia Mingus, a social justice advocate, who talks about the myth of independence and that there's no such thing as being fully independent, and even those who are non-disabled have to depend on one or more people to live their lives. Disability is an illness that makes the person incapable and lacking of all normal abilities. So it is a lack of function. And then finally, like we said in the earlier point, disability leads to lack of independence. And it is only those with disabilities that are incapable of being independent and have to depend on family members, one other person, etc. And those who are non-disabled or have normal functioning bodies don't have to depend on anybody. So the ways that we're going to define disability in this course. Disability is not an individual problem, but rather an individual experience that is unique to each individual and is experienced differently from one person to the next. Disability is a difference like any other and should not lead to the person being viewed as non-conforming with societal norms. Rather, disability is diversity just like any other identity difference and needs to be honored as such. Those with disabilities are not a burden to society, but an asset that makes our society richer in diversity. So we've gone and taking the steps towards addressing those misconceptions that were in the earlier definition, tore them apart for lack of a better word, and addressed them that it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, but it's that. And then finally, these are the resources that I've used to develop this lecture. The Policy on Accessible Education for Students with Disabilities. I provided a link to it. The Myth of Independence by Mia Mingus, and Disability Beyond the Medical Model, because we tend to think that the only model in which disability is defined through is the medical model, and that's it, but there are more ways to go about it. Thank you.